The Cydonia II Report. Abstract. The concept that human evolution and civilization has developed along a linear path is the established viewpoint taught at most schools and universities. A growing body of evidence is being brought to light by a number of dedicated and ethical researchers who have recognized that too many anomalous bits of information or data do not fit the traditional and accepted model. Up until recently, only tantalizing pieces of evidence for a much earlier civilization have been found, but all of that evidence has been either ignored, dismissed, or even ridiculed by recognized experts. Now, artifacts and structures that can be dated to at least the last interglacial epoch, known as the Eemian, which lasted from approximately 140,000 years ago to 115,000 years ago, have been discovered in North America, along the north-running Wallkill River in upper New York State. Not one or two structures, but a whole complex of man-made structures has been recognized stretching over a 200 square mile area. Evidence is presented here that this complex was a virtual duplicate of the Cydonia complex of enigmatic anomalies on Mars, which were discovered by the Viking missions in 1976. The complex on Earth has been heavily damaged by glaciation and erosion, but outlines and remnant expressions of structures fitting the Martian face, Tholus, crater, and hill, outline of the gigantic D&M Pyramid base, and remnants of the city pyramid bases are recognized by their topographic expression on U.S. Geological Survey maps. Each structure or its remnant outline conforms to the size, position, orientation, and spacing of its counterpart on Mars, and both Terra and Martian complexes occur at the same latitude. In addition, there is a granite plateau carved into a rectangle 2.2 miles wide by 3.8 miles long. It is located between the city and the D&M Pyramid remains and contains traces of geometric figures, including a giant Fibonacci spiral and two large circles, similar to that of the lines on the Nazca Plateau. Two granite mountains on this plateau have the shape of recognizable figures. The smaller mountain, Mount Adam, is pyramidal in shape, about 500 feet high, which was the original height of the Giza Pyramid, and reveals possible traces of eroded steps on its sides. The larger mountain, Mount Eve, is shaped like a giant key with three rectangular teeth. It is connected to one of the circles on the plateau. Early European settlers in the valley recorded the discovery of a tunnel carved into the base of Mount Eve that descends about half a mile. A cropglyph known as the Kennex pictogram, which appeared in England in 1991, is identical in shape. Like the key figure in Mount Eve, it points towards a representative of the Tholus on Earth. The Kennex pictogram points towards a representative of the Tholus, that is Silbury Hill in England. The Wallkill River Valley Cydonia II complex, if it once duplicated to a large extent the Cydonia I complex on Mars as theorized here, it can be used to prove that the Cydonia anomalies on Mars are artificial and of intelligent design. A Mars-Earth link would also implicate our ancestors either as the builders or as involved in the building of these structures. They are not viewed as tricks of light and shadow and imagination as NASA has claimed. This discovery, if confirmed, would validate the meticulous work of DiPietro, Molinar, Carlotto, Hoagland, McDaniels, Crater, Brandenburg, and Vanesco. It contributes to a growing link seen by many between mythology and pre-Holocene human history. That link implies a cyclic development of human technology and science during the interglacial periods. Previous civilizations recorded in myth and legend were all but erased when glacial conditions and associated violent earth changes returned. In May 1992, I became interested in the area encompassed by the towns of Wallkill, Walden, Montgomery, and Pine Bush in Orange and Ulster counties, New York, a rural area in the Wallkill River Valley. My primary interest was the unusual aerial activity of anomalous lights at night in this region of the valley. This area was the subject of a 10-year study by Dr. Ellen Crystal on the high-profile UAP activity there, the results of which are published in her book Silent Invasion, published in 1991. Based on over 100 sightings and encounters that I experienced during a 4.5-year period, all of which are documented by time exposures, I have been able to confirm and map this unusual activity and phenomenon. A 9-page interview on my work and personal experience appeared in Encounters magazine in 1995 and was reprinted in Alien Encounters in 1996. During the summer of 1992, I began a geological survey of the valley using bedrock geology maps and USGS topographic maps. I also conducted a magnetic survey of a 24 square mile area between Pine Bush and Walden, New York, which involved at least 800 stations or measurement sites and several traverses paralleling major roads that gave me an additional 1,000 points on the map. This survey was conducted using an EG&G geometrics proton precession magnetometer. A coarse grid-like pattern of widely spaced stations was used to obtain a general map of the magnetic terrain and underlying geological structure. A dense pattern of measurements was used to obtain details of anomalous features. Examine station location map of the Walden Quadrangle in 3 parts, letters A, B, and C. The resulting magnetic map shows distinctive natural magnetic anomalies, mostly dipoles, extending up the center of the valley and aligned with its axis, as well as the structural grain of the Snake Hill Formation that underlies the valley. The Snake Hill Formation is of Ordovician age, with a radiometric age of about 420 million years in age. In technical terms, the underlying geologic structure is a breached anticline which plunges to the north and rises to the south, and whose fold axis is nearly north-south, running down the center of the valley. The center or axis of the anticline is roughly demarcated by the position of the Wallkill River in this region. Magnetic measurements trend from low values of 54,880 gammas, yellow in the map, at the northern end of the map, to high values of 55,160 gammas, colored in purple, at the southern end of the map. The 4 colors, yellow, green, blue, and purple, denote zones of 100 gamma intervals. These zones bend south and point north, following the geological contours of underlying bedrock units that do the same. In other words, the magnetic map reflects the underlying structural geology. The elliptical and circular bullseye patterns denote natural magnetic anomalies caused by underground concentrations of magnetic minerals, such as lodestone and other iron-bearing minerals, such as emery. Pit mining of iron ore occurred during early colonial times, and locations over some anomalies have concentrations of abandoned pits, which are now mostly filled in and overgrown by large trees. The orientation and clustering of magnetic anomalies is probably the result of granitic intrusions containing unusual concentrations of ferromagnetic minerals. As deeper and older strata structurally rise to the surface and become exposed along the fold axis to the south, some granitic intrusions become exhumed. When I first looked at the Walden 7.5-minute quadrangle map, I saw an unusual topographic feature that resembled a large crater. The feature was highly subdued, but was reflected by both stream pattern distribution and geologic slope contours. I thought it might represent an ancient crater. I contacted people in my field, both at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and at the New York Geological Survey. No one knew of a crater in New York State, let alone at that location. When I went into the field, I found no evidence for any kind of impact structure within the boundaries of this circular outline, yet this feature cut across natural erosional trends within the valley. I made a map of this feature. My training and experience from working 11 years in the oil industry enabled me to recognize subtle and natural surface expressions of underlying geologic structure. But what I also discovered was that little geological work had been done in the area, and few recent maps or studies exist. The most recent geological study was done by Holzwasser in 1926, and the only geochemical study by Maxam in 1972. The most recent geological aerial survey maps were done in 1977 by LKB Resources, Inc. of Pennsylvania for the Department of Energy. They are listed in advertisement brochures for sale by the U.S. Geological Survey, but they are not available. My efforts to find a source only led to dead ends. I was even told by the USGS Map Office to contact a branch of the CIA for a copy, but was told by the CIA that none were for sale. Finally, I was able to obtain copies from someone at the New York Geological Survey. There are 3 maps showing aerial surveys for radioactive potassium, thorium, and uranium over the region. There is an interesting and perhaps significant dip in radioactivity within the valley. This is unusual, since the valley is largely floored by the Snake Hill Formation, which consists mostly of black shales and greywackies. Black shales are notoriously more radioactive than most other types of rock, and measurements I took at the surface with a Geiger counter confirmed its above normal content of radioactive minerals. But then why did the survey show the valley where this black shale is concentrated as below normal radiation levels? Suspicious minds might jump to conclusions, but consider this. One possible explanation is leaching from acid rain, but acid rain in most areas of the world is a relatively recent phenomena connected to industrial development. Fresh outcrops are hot, but soil that covers most bedrock and old weathered outcrops in the area are not hot. But why is this valley more depleted in nucleotides at the surface than in other valleys that contain black shales? The answer may lie in the frequent and long-term use of the valley as a corridor for unconventional aircraft, which use plasmas for their source of light. Photographs provided in my web pages and in my book, Unconventional Aerial Phenomena in the Hudson and Wallkill River Valley of New York, published in 2019, show how plasma lights oxidize the atmosphere to form oxides of nitrogen and nitric acid. Prolonged exposure of the ground over thousands of years to mild excesses of acid in the air could be responsible for the anomalous radiation dip on the DOE maps. This valley is the western extension of the UAP corridor in New York State. See Night Siege by Hynek et al., 1987. Seismic surveys across the valley have also been conducted by major oil companies, but those seismic lines are also not readily accessible. They are proprietary data. The latest ones were done in the 1960s by Chevron and Amoco. Information on one line along Route 52 between Pine Bush and Walden, New York, indicates the presence of anomalous high-angle shallow reflectors, which make imaging of deeper structures impossible. Such reflectors are consistent with the presence of igneous intrusives, such as granite. These intrusives also provide excellent cover for an underground alien base, as proposed in Silent Invasion by Dr. Ellen Crystal, making it impossible to detect seismically, particularly if the bases are located within or below the granitic masses. Because Hoagland thought Avebury Circle in England and Silbury Hill represent the Crater and Tholus on Mars, I wondered whether or not there would be a Tholus on Earth. I asked Hoagland for the width of the crater on Mars. He said 2.3 miles. I then asked him for the latitude of the center of the crater, and he told me to contact Jim Herjavec, his other geologist, who was making a map of the Cydonia complex on Mars. Herjavec sent me the map that he was drawing, shown here, and I was able to use that to measure the distance between the center of the crater on Mars to the center of the Tholus on Mars. I used that distance to measure on the USGS, the Walden 7.5-minute quadrangle. I looked to the southeast, and the ruler ended at Stewart Air Force Base on the east side of the Wallkill River Valley. There, staring up at me, was the Tholus on Earth, a circular mound with a satellite mound off to the west. I measured the Tholus on Earth. It was about 1.4 miles in diameter. I then measured the distance of the center of the Tholus on Earth to its satellite mound to the west, called Buchanan Hill on Earth, and found it was the same distance between the Tholus and the satellite mound on Mars, and that distance was 3.2 miles. The outer perimeter or moat of the Tholus on Earth is defined by contour lines on the northeast, west, southwest, and southeast sides. The center of the Tholus on Earth is defined by a large elliptical hill, the apex of which is at the center of the Stewart Air Force Base. The inner groove or moat surrounding the Tholus on Mars is defined by a stream and topographic contours on Earth. The apex of this hill has the radar system for Stewart Air Force Base positioned on it, and it is about 200 feet from the base of the Tholus. The satellite mound on Mars even has a name on Earth, Buchanan Hill, which is located the correct distance from the center of the Tholus and is the correct size and is oriented in the same direction as a satellite mound on Mars relative to other features of the Cydonia complex. A possible reason for the preservation of the Tholus on Earth, because the other features in the valley have been severely damaged by glaciation, are Hemlock Ridge, the Hudson Highlands, and Stenemock Mountains to the north and east of the Tholus, which protected it from glacial destruction. What are the chances of finding a circular feature the same size and shape as the crater on Mars and the Tholus in the same valley, the same distance apart as the crater and Tholus on Mars? At this point in the story, I felt either very lucky or that I was being led to discover these features on Earth. If this was due to luck, I wanted to try my luck a little bit more and see if the face existed on Earth also. The face does not exist in England to the west and southwest of Avebury Circle and Silbury Hill, so I didn't know if there was going to be a comparable feature here on Earth. The Cydonia II connection. The evidence. Because I found no confirmation for the existence of an actual crater, I put that idea aside. In 1994, however, I found another reason to look closely at this feature following my introduction to the Monuments of Mars by Richard C. Hoagland, published in 1992. See also Carlotto, 1991, and McDaniel, 1993, for additional illustrations, delineations, and descriptions of the Martian anomalies for what is called the Cydonia complex. After an encounter with a UAP in the valley on 26 March 1994, I had a vision of a tan disk covered with hieroglyphics. At the center of this disk, I saw an elliptical bulge raised above the other hieroglyphs. The raised area resembled an egg. On that raised area, I saw a crop glyph design that I recognized. It was the octopus, the first true insectogram to appear in England in June 1991. See Bartholomew, 1991, pages 22 and 38. The octopus is an ancient symbol for the water demon, Churchward, 1968. Following that encounter, I took particular interest in the crater-like feature I had mapped earlier near the UFO hotspot. A crater-like construct called Avebury Circle in England has been compared to the crater of Cydonia on Mars by Hoagland. Nearby, in the vicinity of Stonehenge, there is a cone-shaped mound called Silbury Hill. it resembles the Tholus on Mars. These two features and their spacing are at a 14:1 scale of the features on Mars. Because they are associated with crop circle formations and UAP activity, I thought perhaps the crater-like feature in the Wallkill River Valley might have similar significance. I measured the diameter of the crater in the Wallkill River Valley, and it is 2.3 miles wide, which is the same diameter for the crater on Mars. Then I took my hunch one step further. I looked for the cliff, or a remnant of it, to the southwest of the crater, and I found a low ridge with the same relative orientation and proportions as the cliff on Mars. This ridge, like the crater, also cut across the erosional grain of the valley. Then I measured the distance from the crater on Mars to the cliff, assuming that the ratio would be 1:1 as that on Mars, and compared it to the distance from the remnant of the crater on Earth to the remnant of the cliff. They were the same. In addition, a road runs the entire length of the ridge along the axis of the cliff, and coincidentally, this road is called Hill Avenue. Its length from Albany Post Road up to the ridge to the west is exactly the length of the cliff on Mars. From a map provided by geologist Jim Erjavik, who worked with Hoagland, that he made for the Cydonia I complex on Mars, I noted that the center of the crater was at about 41 degrees 36 minutes latitude. My familiarity with latitudes and longitudes for the Wallkill River Valley made this measurement stand out. I then carefully measured the center of the remnant of the crater on Earth, and it came out to approximately 41 degrees 36 minutes. I was stunned. Even though the longitudes are different and dependent on where zero longitude is placed, the fact that the crater had the same latitudes could not be attributed to coincidence. Latitudes are relative measurements between the equator of a planet and its poles, and range from 0 latitude at the equator to 90 degrees at the pole. Thus, latitudes have a geometric relationship, while longitudes and their positions have arbitrary relationships. Subsequent measurements for the centers of the craters on Earth and Mars demonstrated that they were slightly off in a north-south direction by approximately 3,888 feet. I realized that continental drift on Earth had offset the centers by a small amount could be used to calculate when the centers were coincident on both planets. And from that, based on the rate of continental drift on Earth, I could determine when the Cydonia complex on Mars had been built. This is a part of another section or chapter in this report. I then wondered if there might be other features of the Cydonia I complex on Mars in the valley. I calculated the proportionate distance to the face and measured the distance on Earth. There at the end of my ruler was this unusual mound that resembled a brow ridge and nose line. Following the UAP encounter on 26 March, this feature and its resemblance to the face jumped out at me when I looked at the map. Below the nose was a linear depression resembling a mouth, and below that a remnant of what could be a jawline. But the feature was highly eroded, and the Wallkill River had breached the face just below the nose along the upper lip of the mouth. Another tributary of the Wallkill River outlines the top of the face exactly and connects with the main river on both sides of the face. But how could a river as large as the Wallkill form over a large mound when its loop tributary seems to provide a path of less resistance? I would later determine that the mouth on the face was deepened in order to drain a lake that had existed before then in the drowned lands to the south, and that is why various towns to the south are named after islands such as Pine Island and Black Walnut Island. They were called that because when there was a lake to the south of the face on Earth, those areas protruded from the lake as islands. The river clearly cut down next to the nose ridge, oriented perpendicular to its course, and cliffs formed on both sides. Even without the face as a model for what this feature on Earth might have been, there is no way a river the size of the Wallkill could become nested between two prominent hills made of bedrock if the cut had not previously existed. Now we know that there was a cut there that had been deepened in order to drain the lake to the south in the late 1800s. Thus, the Wallkill River had followed the path of its tributary to the north of the face, which was the spillway to the lake that had existed and drowned the lands to the south, which is why they are called drowned lands when the European settlers first arrived there. That lake was drained, and the face has become the prominent feature that was blocking the drainage of that lake in the past. But what is also evident is that the face, crater, and cliff on Earth are proportionately the same size, that is, same scale, as their counterparts on Mars. Also, the face on Earth is the mirror image of the one on Mars, evidenced by the slant and orientation of the nose ridge. I measured the length of the face and came up with 1.4 miles, the exact length of the face on Mars. Then I pulled out a large-scale map, enlarged a photograph of the Cydonia I complex to the same scale, and looked for other features. I found them. I measured the distance from the center of the crater on Earth to the center of where the city lies. That distance is 26 miles, the exact distance between those points on Mars. In addition, the overlay of Cydonia on the Wallkill River fits exactly within the margins of the inner valley, which is demarcated by ridges and mountains, and each position lay at a critical topographic feature or position within the valley. The Cydonia complex on Mars is not constrained by mountain ridges and geologic topography as the Cydonia complex on Earth is constrained. What is the probability of being able to take about 12 geologic anomalies over a 200 square mile area from one planet and find a corresponding match for those same anomalies on Earth? What I discovered is beyond coincidence and wishful thinking. All but one major feature can be located and recognized by topography, stream pattern, and geology. In other words, the features on Earth had to have been constructed before the Cydonia complex had been built on Mars. The following synopsis and maps comprise the body of evidence. In 1987, Richard C. Hoagland published his book, Monuments of Mars, A City on the Edge of Forever, on the Cydonia complex that was discovered during the Viking missions back in 1976. In this diagram that he presents in his book on the geometric relationship model for the Cydonia complex of about 12 different features on Mars, including the face on Mars, I present here his diagram listing the mathematical and geometric relationships that he believes show that this feature is artificial and of intelligent design. If my theory is correct, that the original Cydonia complex existed on Earth in the Wallkill River Valley of New York more than 50,000 years ago and was severely damaged by glaciers during the last ice age, then it's important to examine the replica that was created on Mars in order to preserve those features that would be lost during the last ice age and would not be discovered until mankind recovered from the collapse of previous civilizations during or previous to the last ice age and sent probes out to Mars where they would discover this complex of enigmatic monuments It would also take someone such as Richard C. Hoagland and his team of investigators to define the Cydonia complex, and also a geologist who would be able to look for that complex in the Wallkill River Valley. It was Hoagland's association of Silbury Hill and Avebury Circle in England with crop circles that led me to suspect that the UFO hotspot near Pine Bush, New York, might be related to something similar here on Earth. It also required me to start mapping the Wallkill River Valley back in 1992 before I ever knew about the Cydonia complex on Mars. These conditions were met back in 1992 to 1995, and this report was published first in 1996-97. It hasn't been until recently that researchers and scientists have begun to speculate about previous advanced civilizations on Earth. Inspired by Charles Hapgood's thesis from the 1950s that the ice ages were the result of shifts in the geographic location of Earth's poles, independent researcher and author Mark Carlotto has discovered that numerous sites throughout the world are aligned to what appear to have been 4 previous positions of the North Pole over the past 100,000 years. By virtue of their alignment to ancient poles, Carlotto proposes a new hypothesis, that the original sites were first established by a previous advanced technological civilization that existed throughout the world tens of thousands of years ago and were later co-opted by our ancestors who rebuilt and expanded over and around the older structures while preserving the layout and orientation of the sites to the original pole. Those 4 poles he identified as the Hudson Bay Pole, the Bering Sea Pole, the North Greenland Pole, and the Norway Sea Pole. Carlotto identified 70 different sites based on temples, cities, and monuments found around the world. All these poles are based on the magnetic inclination and declination at these ancient sites. For example, the Bering Sea Pole contains the Temple of the Sun from Peru, Chincana Labyrinth Islands from Bolivia, Tomb of Agamemnon in Greece, and the Amun Temple in Dangiel, Sudan. The Norway Sea Pole includes Chichen Itza in Mexico, the Nazca Lines in Peru, Chan Chan in Peru, Caral Supi in Peru, the Brihadisvara Temple in India. The Hudson Bay Pole includes Teotihuacan, Mexico, Mahabalipuram in India, Hamanga Maui Trilithon in Tonga, Candi Suku in Java, Sri Martan Sun Temple in Kashmir, and Abydos in Egypt. The Northern Greenland Pole includes Tenochtitlan in Mexico, the Parthenon in Athens, Greece, the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, Lebanon, the Western Wall of Jerusalem, Teti Pyramid in Egypt, and Anan Madol in Micronesia. Carlotto gives the Hudson Bay Pole sites an age range of 15,000 to 75,000 years, which falls within the interval of the last ice age, and he gives the Bering Sea site greater than 125,000 years of age. That pole and the North Greenland Pole and the Norway Sea Pole ages fall within the Eemian or Sangamonian Interglacial between 115,000 and 140,000 years ago. The age of the original Cydonia complex on Earth falls within the Eemian or Sangamonian Interglacial and is consistent with Carlotto's ages for the sites of the North Greenland Pole and the Norway Sea Pole. The crater has a tetrahedron built on top of the rim of the crater. The crater by itself does not appear to be unnatural, but the tetrahedron is definitely unnatural, as is the cliff built out on the outsplash apron to the left of that crater. I am proposing here that the crater was intentionally created in order to symbolize the Earth, and the tetrahedron on the rim of that crater represents the polar axis of the Earth at the time that feature was made. Another reason to think that the crater was intentionally created as a symbol for Earth is that on Earth I found a crater of the same size and dimensions as the one on Mars, in the same relative position to the face and the Tholus and the other features of the Cydonia complex. That would imply that it is of importance to whoever built the Cydonia complex on Mars. If the crater represents a symbol for Earth on Earth, then the crater on Mars had to have been intentionally created by a well-designed impact in that specific location. The underlying Cydonia plain appears to be an ancient seabed, and it probably still contains a lot of moisture within those sediments, which would allow the impactor to cause the sediments to splash out, forming the outsplash apron. I recognized the crater-like feature in the Wallkill River Valley south of Pine Bush, New York, by the unusual path of the creeks, Dwar Creek in particular, that surrounded the area where the center of the crater would be located. Take a look at these diagrams and you will see that in my original drawing from 1992, I present an idealized circle for the crater. But when the crater from Mars, the image from Mars, is overlaid on the topographic map on Earth, a much better fit is made, and the unusual shape of the crater seems to be perfectly duplicated by the spread of the creeks on the inside margin of the image of the Martian crater, suggesting that this feature was there originally and that it was damaged and nearly completely destroyed by the last ice age. This feature also is important from the standpoint that the crater on Earth is artificial. It is not an actual impact structure. It was built up from surrounding material or carved into the surrounding bedrock and then later scraped off by glacial ice. Remnants of the crater topography influence the distribution of the streams so that we can see that there is a very close match to the shape of the crater on Mars. This would not be possible if the two had not in some way been connected. The crater is 2.4 miles wide in a north to south direction and 2.3 miles wide in an east to west direction. The rim is narrowest on the south and southeast side on Mars, where the swampy lowland is located on Earth. Topographic alignment of slopes and ridges within the crater depression conform to and define the shape of the crater. Some have radial alignment, while others have circumferential alignment. An isolated magnetic anomaly is located where the tetrahedral pyramid may once have stood. Cliff dimensions. Length is 1.65 miles. Minimum topographic width in the middle is 0.5 miles. Maximum topographic width expression is 0.7 miles. Hill Avenue runs along the crest of the ridge and comes close to demarcating the elongate ends of the ridge or cliff. This road reflects the topography. Excavation at the crest and center of the ridge exposes sediment that is not of glacial or aeolian origin. The ridge is comprised of bedrock and gray-brown silt and clay fill, which is thickly layered. After finding the crater, the Tholus, and the face on Earth, I wanted to find evidence for a D&M pyramid if it once existed. The problem is that the glaciers would have toppled it and distributed its blocks down the valley to the southwest. I looked at the area on the topographic maps and found an area that was large enough and shaped the correct five-sided shape, surrounded by hills and mountains, to have once held the D&M pyramid. This was extraordinary. As you can see from the image that I present here of an overlay of the D&M pyramid on Mars into that space on Earth, it does fit. The problem is the D&M pyramid on Mars is enormous. It is calculated to be 823 meters high. That's 6 times the height of the Great Pyramid in Egypt, which is only 455 feet high. The area of the base of the Great Pyramid is only 13 hectares, or 0.05 square miles in size. The area of the D&M pyramid on Mars is over 2.2 square miles in size. Gravity on Mars is 38% that of Earth. so a pyramid that large could stand and not collapse on Mars. However, provided the foundation on which it was built is stable enough to hold that kind of weight. More recent pictures of the D&M Pyramid were published by Michael Hanlon in 2004 in his book, The Real Mars. He thought, based on the analysis of this composite photograph of the D&M, that it was a natural structure, a natural feature on Mars and not artificial. However, such a large object that stands more than 2,000 feet high has a problem of being explained as a product of natural erosion. The whole area around the Cydonia region, or Mensa, is relatively flat, and there is no evidence that this feature was the product of erosion on Mars. However, if one studies Hanlon's image of the D&M Pyramid, something amazing can be seen through the eyes of a geologist. There is evidence of internal faulting, slumping, and mass wasting, which are the processes of structural failure and collapse. There is also evidence that the pyramid was built on an unstable, soft, that is, water-bearing, sedimentary base, which deformed due to the enormous weight of millions of blocks of rock piled on top of a former ocean bottom. Whoever built this pyramid probably had little choice of location if they were copying identical structures on Earth. Location would have to have been determined by all of the other Cydonia monuments, which were predetermined by latitude. In my drawing off of Hanlon's composite photograph, note that the red spokes represent the 5 ridges on this pentagonal pyramid, one of which, number 2, has broken free and slid down the steep lower right side of this pyramid. Thanks to Michael Hanlon, a high-resolution image of the D&M Pyramid was made public, even though he did not think that there are any artificial structures on Mars. As a geologist, I immediately recognized that the very defects in the geometric shape and the form of the pyramid, which he thought falsified an artificial origin, were due to at least one major internal fault, see cross-section and example above, that allowed the right side, illustrated in the image above, to slump and collapse downwards, producing a deformation toe or arc that extends out nearly 180 degrees around the pyramid's base. Slumps on Earth require resistance to mass movement to be less than the pull of gravity. Water plays an important role on Earth in reducing resistance to mass wasting and collapse. The structural integrity of this pyramid would require the underlying sediment or ground to be able to support the weight above it. Engineers who designed the pyramid probably tried to take into account loading and foundation strength, but had no way of knowing that the weight would, over time, liquefy the foundation due to water in those sediments. There is visual evidence that the underlying sediment was squeezed out from under the pyramid. As the foundation sagged, stress was transmitted upwards, and water under pressure in the sediment could have been forced up through the propagating faults, thereby lubricating them. Eventually, the adjustment faults caused by deformation would result in mass failure and slumping, which is evident in the high-resolution image of the D&M Pyramid. Despite the deformation due to mass wasting, the 5 ridges of the pyramid can be clearly identified. They are numbered 1 to 5 in clockwise order in the above diagram. One can even identify the detached ridge number 2, which has slid to the lower right side of the pyramid, and the position of a sharply defined fault near the top of the pyramid, off-centered, that was responsible for the structural failure and slumping. In addition, on the left side of the outstretched sedimentary plain, one can see clearly a series of arcing compression ridges, colored in green, representing the squeezing of unconsolidated, that is, uncemented sediment out from beneath the enormous weight of the pyramid. These features would not be present if the D&M Pyramid represented a natural structure that was resistant to erosion, such as a granitic or basaltic mountain, because it would be rooted in basement rock. One major difference between Earth and Mars is that the D&M Pyramid was built on solid basement on Earth and therefore could have withstood the size and weight of a pyramid that is over 2,000 feet tall and over 1.5 miles on a side. But even its size on Earth would not have been strong enough to resist the movement of glacial ice that was more than 2,000 feet thick. In the region between the D&M Pyramid and the City of Pyramids, the Cydonia complexes on Earth and Mars are different. On Earth, there are two mountains called Mount Adam and Mount Eve, which rise above the valley floor and present a very different picture from what one finds on Mars. On Mars, between the D&M Pyramid and the City of Pyramids, there is a series of small mounds geometrically spaced apart. Crater and McDaniels published a paper in 1999 on mound configuration on the Martian Cydonia plain. They showed that these mounds were arranged to form triangles of different size and shapes that have geometric and statistical significance and are unlikely to be of natural origin. On Earth, however, Mount Adam and Mount Eve present a very different picture and set of structures. They were carved out of bedrock and not constructed from new material. Mount Adam is in the shape of a pyramid, while Mount Eve is in the shape of a giant key. The pyramid is in the shape of a four-sided pyramid but has been damaged by glacial ice. One can still make out multiple steps on the north side of the pyramid based on the alignment of tree rows that indicate this is not a natural structure. Mount Adam is about 500 feet tall, similar to that of the Giza Pyramid in Egypt. Next to it is the much larger Mount Eve. It demonstrates an unusual shape, and one can make out three teeth to a large key along its length that can only be seen on topographic maps due to the cover by trees. As I had said earlier in this video, I had been given a download of an image in my mind. So when I looked at this area on the topographic map, I saw a large rectangular platform on which Mount Adam and Mount Eve sat. Around it, I saw evidence of a Fibonacci spiral that curved down and created two circles just south of Mount Adam and Eve. I was able to trace the Fibonacci spiral and the circles based on remnant curves in the topography that aligned with the overall structure. I felt more convinced when I found a pictogram or crop circle in England created on the 27th of July 1991 that resembled this key on Mount Eve. Then one needs to ask why the early European settlers in this region named these mountains Mount Adam and Eve and named two towns nearby, Eden and Edenville. One needs to wonder why they felt this area was so important that they would name these structures based on the origin of man in the book of Genesis. One also has to wonder whether the face on Earth, which was recarved into the platform on which it was built after the ice retreated, based on the platform structure on Mars upon which the face was built, whether or not that face has anything to do with the later naming of Mount Adam and Mount Eve after characters in the Bible. Back in 1995, when I took a picture from Mount Houston of Mount Adam and Mount Eve in the distance, the face is visible in between and gives the impression that Mount Adam and Mount Eve look like the torso and breasts of a headless woman, and the head is closer to the camera. So does the key figure carved into Mount Eve, which points towards the face on Earth, have any significance relative to the origin of mankind?